recording. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor David Andress. For those of you who do not yet know David, David is an historian of the French Revolution. He's worked on social and cultural history of conflicts in Europe and the Atlantic world. On the 18th to 19th century, precisely, he's written a large number of books, for instance, The Terror, or the Oxford Handbook of the French Revolution. He's participated and edited this collection of essays. He's has a very, very impressive research record on the French Revolution in particular. As you may know, Dave has also been for a number of years the ADR in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, so a number of you might know him. We had this idea of working together for the first seminar with Dave when we discussed the idea of, or the concept of citizenship. Indeed, Dave and a number of colleagues of the university, Ben Garner in particular, have been working on a series of seminars on citizenship. One took place last year. It was supported by the themes, democratic citizenship in particular. And a number were to take place, are going to take place later this year in this new context. So we would like to address the question of bodies and citizens in times of pandemic from longitudinal perspective, some long-term perspective in which indeed the history plays a key role. In times of crisis, you know very well that the rule of law and democracy no longer go hand in hand. And faced with global threats, governments are increasingly derogative from common law. It's the body that we discipline, our bodies, the bodies that we confine. What Michel Foucault had brilliantly exposed is replayed against to satisfy a form of economic utility. In reflecting upon the extraordinary times we are living in, this webinar, and this is what David and I are going to do now, proposes to address the reaction of states and societies when bodies become dangerous in themselves, not really as individual person, but as physical carrier of the contagion. And you have a tension between the idea to implement a number of emergency measures and powers, and also democracy and the empowerment of citizens. So this is precisely what we're going to address right now. David, without further ado, I'm giving you the floor. So it's up to you now to start the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Leila, and thank you very much for that introduction. Say that we're hoping to do for the next 10 minutes or so, just talk through some historical parallels and issues and incidents that I've looked up and thought about in the last day or two. I don't claim to be an expert on the history of pandemic disease or anything like that, but I think go through, we can all think about very clearly some of the contemporary resonances that come to mind. So, here we go with my sort of prepared seminar paper. One of the things that's been true about epidemic disease for centuries is it creates this stark practical requirement for a physical control of populations, while it also exposes all the fault lines of prejudice and power that pass through such populations. And instead, I think really just lay out here some historical examples to give us something to think about. The resonances will pop into our heads, and that's perhaps something we can then discuss a little bit further afterwards. It's been made lately, for example, of the heroic example of the village of Eyam in Derbyshire. Several hundred people died in the 1660s, and the community isolated itself to contain an outbreak of plague. The BBC sent a Fergal Keen, Mr. Melancholy, to do a little piece from there a couple of weeks ago. It remains unclear about that episode. What perhaps will never be known about that is supposedly voluntary sacrifice imposed on at least some of the members of this community. Like any other village community in England at that time, it was a hierarchy of socioeconomic and cultural power across the village, within individual households, social status, gender, life cycle position, the people dictated anyone's ability to have a true voice in whatever deliberations took place. That self-imposed cordon sanitaire was reproduced on a draconian scale in the last great outbreak of plague in West Europe, which took place in Marseille in 1720. As many historical outbreaks of disease, we can establish in remarkable detail how the plague reached the city aboard the merchant vessel Antoine on the 25th of May of that year. At most Mediterranean ports, there were by this time established quarantine procedures for both cargoes and crews. A ship such as this, which lost a passenger and 7 crew to disease in the passage from the shores of Syria, should have been rigorously confined. But the annual fair of Beaucaire, 50 miles up the Rhone Valley, was preparing to get underway, where from African and Asian shores were filled with merchants from across Europe. As one of the owners of the Grand Saint-Antoine was the deputy mayor of Marseille, Jean-Baptiste Estelle. The 29th of May, the local health officers, having been cajoled into relaxing their vigilance, articles of cloth that we now know must have carried infected fleas were deposited in the city's warehouses. By June, the first reports of isolated plague cases emerged. And for the next 2 months, it marched steadily through the city. Deaths rose from a few dozen each day at the end of July to 500 at the start of August, to around 1,000 a day for a month before dropping precipitously to dozens by October. Over half the population, 50,000 people, surrounded the city of Marseille, and a total number in the of neighbouring communities. The local port of Toulon, for example, saw an even higher proportional death rate than Marseille itself. From July 1720, authorities attempted to cordon off Marseille, but an initial crude ban on contact precipitated a collapse in the city's food supply, adding to the chaos. The imposition of martial law restored a semblance of order in the city, but after the original wave of deaths had passed, the risk of a second wave was so great that extraordinary measures were taken. In the summer of 1721, a stone wall over 6 feet high, supplemented with deep ditches, was built north of Marseille, stretching over 20 miles, and segregating the affected zone of southern Provence from the Rhone Valley. This was guarded by troops with orders to shoot on sight for a year. Combined with further measures of neighbourhood quarantine within local towns, this succeeded in containing the outbreak. It died out by 1722, and emergency measures were lifted in 1723. Now, one of the markers of medical response to epidemics in this period is, of course, the lack of verifiable understanding of transmission processes. Some distinguished doctors worked in Marseille and were able to exclude some hypotheses, such as airborne transmission, empirically, but no closer to understanding what was really happening. Contagion and infection from miasmas, the polluting stench of disease, that might also be the bad air, the malaria, or the swamps and cellars. This was prevalent assumptions of the time. And these assumptions were always political, sometimes vividly so. During the French Revolutionary Terror of the 1790s, one argument made by scornful Parisian radicals about the inhabitants of Lyon who rebelled against the capital's authority was that their minds and their morals were affected by the miasma rising from local rivers. How widely political such ideas were is illustrated in a fascinating new book by Kevin Sienna called Rotten Bodies, Contagion in 18th century Britain. From the starting point of fears about so-called jail fever or typhus in the 1700s, a disease we now understand as transmitted by parasites, Sienna shows how the political and judicial authorities of the period understood it as a product of the inherently corrupted bodies of the poor. It could, of course, be transmitted to respectable people. As in the 1750s, and a notable outbreak around the Old Bailey attacked lords and gaffers in the Lord Mayor of London. But it was understood as being essentially the consequence of class environments and physical natures that were disgusting and produced disgusting infectious bodily secretions. One of the great public fears of the age around typhus arose from the practice of imprisonment for debt, where respectable individuals fallen on hard times might have the miasmas of the criminal classes inflicted on them. Siena calls plebeian putridity may have formed an underlying stratum of political and social assumptions throughout the period of the Industrial Revolution and the age of urbanization and scientific hygiene that followed. The ages, of course, are also ages of slavery and documented unhygienic horrors of the passage, as well as of ever-expanding imperialism. In regard to the social and racial dynamics of slavery and shifting attitudes over time, much could be said that I'll confine myself to a single brief observation here. Will have been the film The Help, as one of its motifs, the petrifying fear among southern white people of bodily contamination from black servants, as at the 1960s when the film is set. I just observe here that over 2 centuries earlier, one of the pieces of advice given to Frenchmen seeking to become expert slave traders was to learn how to judge the health of prospective purchases by tasting their sweat. I'll just leave that thought with you for a second. Returning to the general notion of hygiene, the inescapable fact historically is its complete interlocking globally with Western imperialism. Now, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, founded as a school of tropical medicine in 1899 by Patrick Manson, a doctor who practiced in colonial East Asia and was also medical advisor to the British Colonial Office. Several links can be drawn between such institutions and authorities in post-imperial powers. Determining the etiology of diseases such as sleeping sickness and malaria went hand in hand with the development of prophylactic practices, primarily for the use of Western troops in infected regions. The starting point to think about the plague is British Hong Kong in 1894. Alexandre Yersin was at the request, curiously enough, of the French government, discovered the bacterium responsible for the plague. Now bears his name, Yersinia pestis. It was 2 years later that Hafkin, from Ukraine, a member of the Pasteur Institute in Paris, developed in Mumbai the first vaccine against the plague, working at the direct request of the British government of India. Hafkin tested this vaccine, like the earlier one for cholera, on himself, was undoubtedly a heroic figure. And the laboratory in Mumbai became 2 decades later the Hafkin Institute, which is now a university biomedical teaching and research facility. The researchers were nonetheless at the heart of imperialism, and that was confronted with the so-called third pandemic of bubonic plague, which had begun to develop in southwestern China 4 decades before, and in the 1890s was ravaging Asia. It would kill over 12 million people in colonial India, for example. It reached as far afield as Madagascar, Hawaii, San Francisco, and Glasgow, where in the summer of 1900, 17 people died of plague in the tenements of the Gorbals. In such a poverty-stricken place, the plague gripped a British community, being controlled by rigorous quarantine and contact tracing. Yet again, how the traditionally indiscriminate force of infection is also always a profoundly social and political phenomenon. I hope we can now think about at length from a variety of different angles. I'll hand back to Lola at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was really fascinating. We hear all the time that the crisis is unprecedented. It is to some extent, but 12 million people died of the plague in India in the 19th century. So it's not really the first epidemic, of course. So I'm going to use my privileged rights as a chair to say a few more things from legal and political perspective, and then actually I will give the floor to everyone for comments and questions. So as I said in the introduction, in times of crisis, what's really interesting to see is that the rule of law and democracy no longer go hand in hand. The governments faced with global threats are increasingly derogating from common law in the name of population protection. The state of exception, and I'm using the term which has been not exactly coined by Agamben, but used by Agamben, becomes the norm. We've seen that in a number of Western democracies. The US started, and then we had France, and we had the UK recently. In France, just to give you an example, we've created a new term called the state of health emergency. In the UK last week, the Coroner Act was adopted. I invite everyone to take a look at it. I'll send it to everyone. It's a really interesting text, a long text, giving some powers to the state to manage the crisis. So the state of exception was actually first conceived or conceptualized by the German constitutionalist Carl Schmitt. The state of exception was conceptualized in the general context of a critical theory of liberal democracy. At the time for Schmitt, the prince decided the state of exception. He was the judge of its legitimacy. However, given the immense risk that such a regime poses to the protection of human rights, the constitutional guarantees of the rule of law must make it possible to frame the power of the sovereign, and that's the question today. So reflection carried out on the question generally deal with the state of emergency, while the state of exception remains in a conceptual and legal vagueness. It's what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben has denounced in reaction to the Italian policy of confinement, the state of exception. It's really from a human rights perspective, a human rights guarantee perspective, the treaties and the constitution are pretty clear. The Article 4 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights refer to the existence of a public emergency which threatens the life of the nation and the existence of which is officially proclaimed. It authorizes the state to take as strictly as the situation requires measures which derogate from international obligation. Furthermore, regardless of circumstances, and that's really very important, no derogation is allowed from fundamental rights. So we're talking about the right to life, the prohibition of torture and slavery, judicial guarantee, including the right to a fair trial, legal personality, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So there is a sort of minimum basis for rights, actually. What we see today, I'm afraid, is already, including in democracies, a number of derogations from these very fundamental rights. We've seen that before. It's not completely unprecedented because the state of emergency, or rather exception, has been used very often in recent times against terrorism, against the terrorist threats in particular. So it's a very risky discipline, as we were saying in the introduction, because in fact, state declare or not, the exceptional measure extend from day to day to very heterogeneous situation, all considered as a serious threat to the state. So there is a sort of inflation of fear relayed by communication technologies and science erected as a source of truth, which amplify the phenomenon. This is exactly what Michel Foucault had brilliantly exposed in he was, raising the idea of the body. It's happening again. We see, interestingly, if you've observed what's going on in the developing world, we see this tension, this sort of fear of the body as a carrier of contagion. We see that in India with the migrants on the road who are forced to be disinfected by the state. We see it in Africa, it's starting at the moment. Interestingly, even in time of pandemics, the right to remain silent. In fact, people will are remembering already, because a number of class actions are getting ready, that you have rights and you can't violate them, even in case of very severe, new, unprecedented emergency situation. So democracies at the moment are very much on a tightrope between emergency and the rule of law, and have to find the right balance between repression and protection. So that's it for me. I'd like to thank Dave again, and thank very much all the participants, because I see that we are 42, which is great and probably unprecedented for a research seminar. So I'd like to give you the floor, everyone. So there is one easy etiquette, because I think in this WebEx system, we don't really see people so well waving their hands. So if you do have comments or questions, please write down in the chat section. Can you kindly write what you'd like to ask? I know from the participants I see in the list that some colleagues might have comments or questions already. I know Professor Peter Lee was interested, maybe reflecting upon Foucault. I know Dr. Alciato de la Ferrière has worked on religion and pandemics for an article he's going to publish. So I see Peter, if you have questions or you want to ask, make a few comments, please go ahead. I don't see yet questions. Dave, I have maybe a question for you. You mentioned the reference to the very I'm afraid infamous plague situation in India at that time. Can you maybe elaborate further upon that, and how bodies were treated, and how to some extent this reaction of the British colonizer triggered or supported the claim for independence at one point?
I can say a little bit. I mean, it's not that's right at the end of my area of expertise in a kind of strict sense. This is one of the primary facets of imperial governance generally. It is operating without consent, and the whole structure of law in India in fact becomes more authoritarian over time. I think it's very interesting to look back to the 18th century in India, when the East India Company first takes over. But actually very concerned to be seen as operating in the existing kind of historical rights and frameworks of existing Hindu law codes and Mughal law codes, giving them a kind of cultural respectability. This is something which, over the course of the 19th century, as the belief of the Western kind of scientific imperial complex gets stronger and stronger, as they more clearly establish in their own minds that their scientifically based knowledge on how to manage populations is superior, is inherently superior. They relay that more and more thickly on any sense of India having been a time-honoured civilization. And the general British opinion of the political capabilities of the Indian people in 1700 is much lower than it was in 1800, because the British see themselves as having ascended to that level. And the ironies of this, of course, come in with the development of anti-colonial and national liberation movements, which are using the rhetorics of liberalism and nationalism against this kind of, well, in the one case, a kind of authoritarianism, a throwback to earlier ages within European history, but it is also justified by a sense of scientific superiority that is simply inherent in the British rulers, that they know better what to do. And this, of course, is a clash which is not resolved. The war situation, expectations in Indian nationalism were dashed by the British governments after 1918. And the whole 1930s and 1940s is a period of incredibly sophisticated Indian nationalism into a brick wall of British prejudice, which can't get past that essentially 19th century perspective on the inherent superiority of their way of thinking about things. Any aspect of the way in which Indian people's thoughts, bodies are disciplined within that framework of superiority right down to independence.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks very much for that, Dave. And I think it gives a very great transition to the question that Bob just asked. He said, I'd be interested to hear how the science-led approach would be taken in the past. The role of science and of experts that we very much see today.
Well, I think as general observation, it's recognizing that for most of the last 400 years, science-led approaches are top-down. They're inherently authoritarian. They involve digging out the products of what's assumed to be scientific knowledge to people who are assumed not to be able to understand them and not to be worth trying to explain what you're doing. There is a certain amount of back and forth about this. It's interesting to reflect, of course, when inoculation of smallpox is brought in the 19th century. Nobody knows what works. This is the germ theory of disease. They don't know why it works. They only know empirically that it does, but it's also still risky. But it's effectively imposed on significant sections of the population with sanctions for not going through with it. There are attempts to sort of set examples amongst the ruling classes to voluntarily have them inoculated. But really is the long-term pattern of this is that people who work very hard to become scientifically educated don't think other people can understand what they're doing, but they need to have it done to them. And this reflects, in a broader sense, some of these issues about the tradition of the sovereign state itself. Its historical existence is anti-democratic. The democratic space within modern culture has been forced open to a much longer-term tradition of sovereign state power. And the tradition of sovereign state power holds in the background. This, of course, is going back. This is one of Schmidt's classic points that it is the sovereign who decides when to break the rules. The rules only exist on the terms of the sovereign. And when they decide there's a state of exception, the rules can be managed to disappear. And this is the historical context in which all of these other things play out. That we had absolute sovereigns before we had notions of democratic rights. And democratic rights have never succeeded in completely erasing that sovereignty tradition, which lives in the background, ready to emerge when people think they need that authoritarian political father figure to put things straight.
Yes, yeah, that's absolutely fascinating again, Dave. So the idea of knowledge and force, and indeed, as you said, the very fact that these democratic rights are relatively recent, really, and it's always a fight to keep them. I have a few more questions. A question from Karen: how much do you think this history informs us for our current pandemic? And linked with Foucauldian ideas of power and control, how much do you believe this may also impact on today's approaches? I have a question from Alexi then. David, are you still here? Yeah, you're back.
That's the mic back on. We're venturing very broadly into areas I don't necessarily feel that I have the voice we should be hearing about this. I think it would be interesting if we can get some of the other. Once I get into the 20th century, I am bucking, generally. But there's probably other people with different kinds of expertise that just typing something could volunteer to pop up on screen and talk to us for a couple of minutes.
Absolutely, it's a good idea. So let me read Alexi's question, and then I think people with expertise on more like 20th century related issues, and also, Foucault or other, thinkers, feel free to pop in. I'm reading the question of Alexi. States seems to have taken different approaches to state emergencies. In the US, constitutional guarantees appears to still be in place, and the Congress was active in passing a legislative response. In France, the choice is ruled by decree and suspension of the Constitutional Council. In Hungary, indefinite emergency powers for the executive. Do those scholars in the group have a reading on these different scenarios? So maybe to this one I can respond if you don't mind, and then I'd like to hear, from our participants. You're very right, Alexia. Actually, it's really fascinating to study the different state of emergency and see the cultural differences between countries. To the example of France, it's quite authoritarian and not surprising because it's often the case there. And it's ruled by not exactly decree, but it's certainly very much the executive which is in charge. In the UK, the parliament has played a greater role, and again, it's not surprising. The text of the Coroner Act is slightly different. It's not only about emergency, it's also about the management of the crisis. In a country like India, they have not really passed an emergency text. They're relying a lot on, interestingly, the Disaster Management Act. They're also relying a lot on the Supreme Court, strangely, because the government has asked the Supreme Court yesterday to sort of limit the freedom of speech. And what we could find in the media on the corona to officially fight against false, fake news, but de facto to limit the freedom of speech. Actually, the Supreme Court of India is not really keen to go into this direction. You've given the example of Hungary. Well, Hungary, again, not very surprising, although a member of the European Union, extraordinary power to the executive without any timing, without any time frame. So again, this is extremely worrying. So yeah, very fascinating to study the cultural differences and the way the state of emergency, if not exception, is used in different democracies. We're not even talking about non-democratic powers. So I would like to take the floor now. We have different experts, so feel free really to pop in, switch on your camera so that not only David and I are discussing, because we are not specialists of everything. Because I know he's here. Alexei would like to say a word on religion and how these pandemics have been dealt with by religious powers and the state and the church across centuries.
Can you hear me? Can you
We do hear you very much.
Yeah, across centuries, I'm definitely not going to say. So one is.
Okay, I don't know if it's me, but I think you're frozen.
Yeah, what you mentioned, so the article I'm working on right now, in terms of limiting religious activity and congregations.
Sorry, Alexei, we don't hear you. Interrupt you, Alexei. Can you do that again? Maybe you switch off the camera, but we hear you better. You use the audio.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been looking at, on the one side, different approaches in terms of limiting communal or collective religious activities in different countries, and how this has given rise to different forms of resistance. And so we've seen that, and one of the things that's been coming up is, one, that you have variances in terms of state responses. So, for example, you have responses in France where the state limits, I believe it's now 10 people within a religious assembly. You have responses in the United States which are using public order acts to limit religious congregations. You've had a recent battle between the Supreme Court of Brazil and the Bolsonaro presidency in terms of the debate of whether religious activities and religious services constitute an essential service, an essential activity. And for me, there, in a way, the Brazilian case is particularly interesting because there we're making explicit a debate which is actually not happening in a lot of other legal societal contexts as to what should be counted as an essential activity, an essential service in these sorts of situations. In the French case, for example, there's been a definition of essential services, essential activities, mainly based on bodily and physical needs. So whether it's healthcare, sanitation, access to food, also in terms of what professions are allowed to continue functioning. So in terms of garbage disposal, in terms of sanitation, but all those activities which aren't directly linked to the bodily or linked to the physical are generally classified as non-essential. And for me, that seems to indicate particular assumptions or particular worldview that's associated with a strong form of secularism that we don't see, for example, in, the Brazilian case, where there's a genuine debate, a genuine societal debate as to what constitute the essential values, the essential norms which the body politic should protect. You see something rather similar happening in Ghana, where there's been more of an explicit debate as to whether collective religious assemblies should or should not be deemed as essential services. And the religious case is interesting. Both you mentioned that because it touches on the question of freedom of conscience or freedom of religion. It derives or it harks to a basic or a fundamental liberty in the liberal tradition. But I think it's also specific and important because of the importance of praxis within different religious traditions, which is to say that fundamentally deeply held beliefs in many religious traditions are fundamentally tied up to a form of physical practice and a form of physical presence, which is difficult, or at least historically has not been replaced by these sorts of remote technologies that we have. Although there are examples. So there's a debate, for example, within Jewish circles regarding the requirement of creating a quorum, what's called a minyan, to have at least 10 male members of the community to practice certain rites such as the Kaddish. And so some Jewish religious authorities recommend using online technologies such as Zoom to form a quorum in order to practice those practices, to fulfill those religious rites. There are others who are looking at the historical tradition. So, for example, there's a 13th century form of the Kaddish that was developed in Europe for precisely those Jews who lived in rural communities where they weren't able to form a quorum in order to fulfill those rites. So you see these different sorts of innovative responses, which are either responses of resistance, where religious authorities just refuse to comply with confinement orders, or responses of technological innovation, or responses of looking within the religious tradition itself for similar sorts of practices where they can revive those. And indeed, there's probably a lot, and I haven't looked enough into the question yet, given that a lot of these religious traditions have developed in context, or they co-developed with periodic pandemics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Alexei. Absolutely fascinating. If you observe that at the moment, you do see in a number of countries resistance to the confinement for religious motives. I see on a daily basis in India people wanting to go to the temple or to the mosque and refuse the confinement for that. And there is a broad question we can ask, which is the question of hubris. Is the state, thinking it's bigger than God? So that's the question often population asks to their sovereign. It's not a new question. This question was asked during the play, the different episodes Dave referred to. And at the time, one of the saying from the Muslim community in particular, but really not only, is that it was a God's, disease, and that there was nothing we can do against it, and that was just about time. So that's great. I see. I don't know, Pete. Peter Lee, are you here? If you're here, Pete, you want to take the floor to talk a little bit about the Foucauldian approach. I see that Deborah is here. I'd be quite interested in knowing more about the response of the arts, because I think art and creative activities have always had a lot to say in these times of pandemics. Or someone else actually, but you're here, Deborah, Professor Deborah Segarian, or Professor Peter Lee, or anyone who'd like to say something. No. Okay. Do you have any other questions, everyone? Okay. Questions in the chat, or take the floor just as Alex has just done.
I'll just, because I've already spoken, just I imagine maybe some people are having, I had some trouble with the technology at the beginning, so it's possible that some people are having that issue as well.
So people, if you want to speak, if you want to say something now, you just unmute your mic and your camera possibly as well. So on the bottom of your screen, you have icons with the mic and the camera. So you just unmute that. Simon is here. Simon, you might want to say something or to comment. In the meantime, because I had prepared for you, something. So in the meantime, someone is on the
Hello.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's not really anything profundity to say, really, but just to pick up on some of the historical and contemporary examples. I think it raises interesting questions about globalization as well, doesn't it? And how, and obviously, the ways in which it's virus is transmitted is through the intensifications of communication and transport and whatever it is. People and so on, and yet on the other hand, we're seeing a return to lots of the things that Dave was talking about, where the state is kicking in as the sovereign power is kicking in again, really. So I was just really as a reflection, really, that it helps us think about the complex process of globalization, really, and the role of the state.
Absolutely, you're very right. Well, we are maybe waiting for more comments and questions. We have a few more minutes left, really. A few readings we may recommend, because I know we have a very diverse crowd here. Everybody's from social sciences and humanities, and within humanities and social sciences, we have all very different backgrounds, but really fantastic to see so many people, 43 for the first time, with all sorts of disciplinary backgrounds. So thanks very much, everyone. So reading, of course, Foucault survey and punish. Also have from La Boétie the very famous discourse on voluntary servitude. We have from Claude Lefort the complication, because it's really important to complicate the situation today to understand it better. I don't have it with me right now, but you have the new book of Frank Dicotter, How to Become a Dictator. Sort of manual. I don't know if you want to put that in place for yourself, but really, because it's fascinating to see the role of propaganda in particular. And because I'm shameless, from me, Indian modernity, discussed a little bit the role of modernity and how it plays out in this type of situations as well. Right, we have more people here wanting to say something, to comment.
I'd like to make a brief comment, if I may. I'm in the hospital today, so I thought you might like to have someone with a first-hand experience of what's going on. I find it fascinating that the ideas around the way that the state uses science and science uses the state to control these types of epidemics. So that was a fascinating comment from David. But what's happening is that The state is using politics in the middle of very clear scientific evidence around what the people is within the situation. Many people don't agree necessarily with the medics and the scientists that we should protect ourselves from COVID. Many people say, I'm about to get COVID and get over and done with and move on with my life. There's great tension, I think, within the debate at the moment, and brought out with very, very confusing messages. We're getting the chief scientific officers and the chief medical officers who are bowing to huge political pressure being put on them and their message at the moment. So, and we see that in the hospitals. We're in government or not in protective garment next. Everybody has to wear protective garments for all contact with all patients. One minute we're operating, the next minute we're doing nothing. And so it is really interesting the way that the message becomes quite distorted quite quickly by the state.
That's fascinating, Richard, because you have first-hand experience, and indeed, this is very much the question at stake, and probably everyone here is reflecting upon that, because there's not much we can understand. The messages are very often contradictory. Not to mention that the big science message comes from a country which is not democratic, not transparent, and for which we don't know so much about science and whether things have worked for real or not. What do you think about that, the science coming from China?
I think over the last few years, the science coming from China has been better and better. So we begin to trust it more. But the issues with these totalitarian regimes, like what they're allowed to release, and as an ophthalmologist, I'm very aware that the very first, one of the very first doctors to die from it was an ophthalmologist who said that we have a problem. And I think he needs to be recognised in the UK as someone, as a hero who stood up to the state, but nothing to protect him. And he was one of the very first victims of it. Yes, but even in the UK, we have a situation where the state, I think, is manipulating information coming out. Our death rates quite wildly as pressure is put on hospitals to maybe investigate the death rates more than they need to, get the message more than they need to. So I think we need to, and I'm sure we are coming at data with a certain degree of skepticism and trying to work out exactly what's going on. I think it's fascinating that the Imperial College Group are able to publish really science, not in the normal way, just by directly publishing stuff on the line. And I think that's very, very powerful. And that is now beginning to drive the agenda, which I think is amazing.
Fantastic. And it's also very inspiring for us, I suppose, as a community of scholars, because there are a number of things that we can say, hopefully freely, using the techniques that we have at hand today online, and this seminar is that really. Thank you so much, Richard. Do you have any other thing you'd like to share?
I think what the university is doing is very inspiring in the middle of COVID, and I'm sure that how we have our society together and our health service together after COVID is going to be really, really important. And I think wonderful opportunities for us to change and do things in a way that we haven't done before.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I see, Karen, do you have anything you'd like to share? If you say something, I think you can, because I unmuted you. Hear you, Karen. Can you, on the bottom of your screen, can you?
It was nothing quite so specific, actually. I was nodding because quite a few of the ideas resonated. The first being the idea of history linking with now, and how we can learn from history and the way in which things were done historically. also the ideas we've talked about, well, we've sort of glazed over some of the ideas of Foucault, governmentality, the sovereign state having an influence on how people govern and politics, etc. And also what Richard was saying just now about how politically these things can be manipulated, and how statistics and information that we are fed through the media, perhaps, which is politically influenced, on how we see a particular situation and the agendas that are linked with that, in terms of perhaps before we were being told it was only old people that were dying. Now we keep getting information about young people dying, and the ways in which we're always told how many people have died rather than how many people have survived, and the manipulation perhaps of testing, and how many people are being tested, etc. So there's a whole load of issues that resonated with me as somebody that works with figures, but also as a historian. Yes, so that's what I'd quite like to add. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think there's a lot to do in common, and unless we have more comments or questions, I was going to say a few words of conclusion, but do we have more comments or questions, people? And from a tech perspective, because I see here Professor Adrian Hope, who's here, is the director of the theme technology, future and technology. Adrian, do you want to say something about the tech? It's quite interesting.
My video as well. Nice to join you. Great event, Layla. I'm not sure I've got anything particularly useful to say. From my point of view, it's been great to just listen and learn from people more and reflect on those lessons from times gone by. I suppose I'm quite interested in analytics and sort of what we can learn from the patterns in the numbers. But the great adage in computer science, a cliche you might say, is garbage in, garbage out. So if you're trying to draw conclusions from unreliable data, you will draw unreliable conclusions. So so it is everyone else goes to make sense of the information and draw some predictions from it. So tools like genetic algorithms are fabulous for spotting patterns in data. Can use them essentially for two purposes: classifying and predicting. Everybody wants to make predictions at the moment using those kind of tools. But as I say, if you're learning patterns in unreliable data, you will get unreliable predictions.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Yes, that's very important, and that's one of the issues we're facing probably with China. You know, unreliable data. We don't really know actually. That's great. We have exactly 3 minutes, and I think it's pretty great because we've managed to speak for 1 hour, to converse for 1 hour. We were 43, which is really impressive compared to the number we normally have at the university. So I think we should really keep this format forever, at least to the real life, you know, seminars. A few things I'd like to say on these particular topics. If you have written anything, if you have written in the news, if you have TV interviews or whatever, if you have published scientific article, please get back to me or to us, because we can put all that together on a special page of the blog or the website. And in this regard, I'd like to thank very much Andy Clegg and Marika Jagger, who've helped me a lot to prepare this first seminar, in particular. And for next week, do come back to me, get back to me for ideas for the next weeks to come. It doesn't have to be about the pandemics at all. I mean, the first seminar was about the pandemic for obvious reasons, but we need to talk about many other things. So, and it's not only social sciences and humanities, not at all. So if you have more science-related topics, art-related topics, do get back to me, because we want to have these very interdisciplinary, and I think very interesting seminars as much as possible weekly. Oh, well, again, thanks very much, everyone. Thanks very much to Dave for his fantastic presentation. We'll be very much in touch, and I wish you a great week ahead.